Assalamu alaikum, girls. After a long time, I'm picking up with Matthew Arnold. It's where we stopped. We had a brief introduction of Arnold's time, the Victorian era as such, and the great changes that were taking place, the drastic that were taking place in terms of in the fields of science, industry, and even politics, especially education and political reforms, and even in agriculture for that matter, and in terms of suffragettes, where people were fighting for their rights. So Arnold came into a stage that was set up for turmoil, a lot of upheaval, a great deal of upheaval. So people had seen the after effects of French Revolution, and they understood. They've come to a sort of understanding as to how any change could not only bring in some good things, but at the same time, one should also be ready for a great deal of bloodshed if you are looking for, well, any kind of revolution for that matter. So many rights were being passed, so many bills were being passed in the parliament, in the lower house and the upper house were fighting against it most of the time. And yes, so amidst this huge scene of turmoil, Matthew Arnold entered, and he too looked at literature as something of a medium to bring in everyone together, to join hands, to join forces against all kinds of tyranny and cruelty. Okay, so he saw literature as something, as of a guiding light, all right, as a device that could transform the society, all right. Because see, people were losing hold of religion, their belief, their faith was being questioned, as I mentioned earlier in my previous video, as to how with the theory of evolution, Charles Darwin's idea of the origin of species, how it put into question the very idea of human creation, right? As to one eternal being creating the earth and the sun, the universe, and the and humans, right? The idea of the book of Genesis was questioned, the Bible was questioned. So you see, people were losing faith. So when you lose faith, what happens? You lose your hold on right and wrong. What is right and what is wrong? You tend to question yourself, right? So so there were people like Arnold, Carlyle, Ruskin, who were the prominent voice of the conscience of the age. Conscience of the age, as in they were trying to reason out. They were trying to be reasonable. They were trying to, bring reason to the chaos, created by all these things. Like, in terms of industry, when you look at the way people were moving away from villages and going to cities, and they were losing their faith. Once again, they were being led astray, right? So when you look at Charles Dickens novels, you'll find so many people who were so innocent while living in their villages, so pure and innocent and God fearing. Once they are exposed to the city life, they begin to question their own belief in goodness, in righteousness, right? So all of this was happening, and there were plenty of other educators, and of course people of faith who were trying to look at Christianity from a different perspectives, different angles. So they were trying to revolutionize a little bit of their faith to suit the purpose of the man in that age. All right. So we have seen what Victorian Criticism did, right, in terms of how with the printing press there were many people were reading a lot, and therefore the demand for reading material seems to have increased. And with that, of course, plenty of people were getting educated, and of course when education was made free for everyone, people were becoming more aware of their rights, aware of their duties. And of course, there is a sense of advancement is a necessity, a need for advancement, a pressing need for advancement, which was not there before. That is, in a romantic era, it was sort of like restricted to the few elite circles, okay, restricted in the elite circles. But in the Victorian era, it spread wide, okay. It was a mass movement as such, right? So Arnold in Victorian age says, and we are here as on Darkling Plain. It's one of the famous lines of Dover Beach. The last few lines of Dover Beach are here. And we are here as on Darkling Plain, swept with confused alarm of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Right? It sort of like sums up everything that Victorian age stood for. So people were panicking. They were in this dark plain where people were clashing against each other, not knowing which way to go, which one is right, who they are fighting against. Right? Ignorant armies clash by night. Obviously, the army is never told. The foot soldier is never told what he is fighting for. Right? So a commander gives them the command to fight, and they just simply fight against, their own brethren. Right? That's a state of being. So see, look at this. The aristocrats were barbarians, middle-class Philistines, and common populace beyond provincial and uncivilized, lacking in culture. We have already discussed this point in the last class, so refer to my previous video to understand that particular point. So some of the critical works. Well, Arnold did write plenty of poetry, and of course a play as well, plays as well. But since we are concerned mainly with criticism, with some of his key critical works are Preface to the Poems, 1853, on translating Homer, 1861, Culture and Anarchy, one of his most famous writings, Essays in Criticism, Dogma, Literature and Dogma, and Democracy. So we'd be making references to Culture and Anarchy, on translating Homer, and Preface to the Poems, and of course Essays in Criticism quite a bit. Alright, so Arnold's social philosophy on culture implied it was a cure for the ills of the day. Okay, cure for the ills of the day, as in he believed that literature as in like the culture itself offered guidance. Okay, according to him, it was necessary that. So you see, it's I don't exactly remember where I stopped with, so I'll just continue here. So you see, to him, culture is a necessary force that will prevail, that can prevail, in the absence of any other guidance. Okay, to him, culture implied everything. I mean, everything in the sense art or literature or any form of practice. Okay, any form of communal practice. That's what culture would be for Arnold. Okay, so to him, culture is something that offers harmonious development of human nature. So, you must have heard of this adage. I mean, I have quite often. You can't always be inspired and motivated. So discipline discipline works well in that case, in the absence of inspiration and motivation. I mean, that's not exactly exactly worded adage as such, but then the idea is that your practice is what makes your character. What you do every day, every single thing that you do every day, is what makes you. Okay, as in we may spout all sorts of nonsense about how good we are, how honest we are, how cultured we are, but it should reflect in everything we do, right? So to him, culture is something that guides us, that guides people, that guides that guides the society towards perfection. Okay, so you see, it's a cultural practice. Even drawing columns, rangoli in front of your house is a cultural practice, right? So what is the idea of it? What is the idea of putting geometrical designs in front of your doors? Of course, you may have some religious connotation attached to it, or significance attached to it, but the point remains that it is a cultural practice, right? It's a cultural practice. It aims for a certain perfection, right? So whatever you do, whatever practice you have, whatever art you have, whatever whatever little habits you have in terms of your in the culture you live in, right, they all aim towards a certain perfection. Okay, so you see, it is a social force leading to social progress. So to him, culture is something you need to stick to your culture, because that is the guiding force that would lead you to social progress. The society as a whole will progress if it is, strong in its culture. Having its origin in the love of perfection, it's a study of perfection. It moves with the force not merely or primarily of the scientific passion for pure knowledge, but also of the moral and social passion for doing good. Okay, so it has this moral and social passion. It's not merely scientific in nature, it has this moral and social necessity for doing good that compels one to be better, be a better person, right? Contribute to the society, contribute to the to the well-being of the society. So culture which believes in making reason and the will of God prevail, believes in perfection, in the endless expansion of powers, in endless growth in wisdom and beauty, right? So culture, that the kind of culture that believes in reason, that believes in making reason, okay, that believes in making the will of God prevail, that is bound to be the best kind of culture. Okay, so speaking of poetry, Arnold believes that the future of poetry is immense. Future of poetry is immense in the sense that poetry has been used by the romantic poets for a different reason: to connect with nature, to connect with the intuitive man, to connect with oneself, right? So man was a center stage during the romantic era. But here Arnold believes that poetry has so much potential. It is so much bigger than man himself, right? The future of poetry is immense because in poetry, where it is worthy of its high destinies, our race, as time goes on, will find an even surer and surer stay. Because he believes that poetry is something that can stay when rest is gone. Rest is gone in the sense the other kinds of literature, the other kinds of, or especially here, the intent or the implication is that when you lose your sense of moral purpose because your faith is being questioned, in that case it is necessary that poetry would take its place. Okay, so poetry, he designates poetry a very high destiny, okay, very high purpose. When every creed and every dogma is questioned, he feels poetry alone could fill the gap and boost the morale of the people. As in, boost the morale of the people, as in, when everyone's losing faith and everyone's turning away from God and not really worrying about whether what they are doing is right or wrong, whether it is, whether it is acceptable or not, whether they are, not really, listening to the conscience at all. In that case, he feels poetry can take up the place of one's faith. The strongest part of our religion today is its unconscious poetry. Unconscious poetry as in poetry that does not hit on your face, that creeps inside you and makes you think, makes you feel, makes you do. Right? The strongest part of a religion today is the unconscious poetry, the poetry that is hidden, that is covered. Okay, so our religion today is wavering, but the only part that seems to sustain it is its poetry. So you see, there are so many. Whenever you hear any sermons, or even not even sermons, even when you listen to any political leader, or when you just, even the WhatsApp messages that you get every day, right? You're overloaded with these messages. Every word that is written out that makes you think is poetry, of course. So there is some truth in what Arnold says, don't you think? See, even like back some 5 years ago, I don't think so many people actually thought about poetry or thought about thought so much about any philosophical musings. I don't really think so. But now today we find so many WhatsApp messages that are purely pure poetry. So Arnold cautions against two fallacies of analyzing poetry. Fallacies as in two errors we may commit unwittingly. Unwittingly as in unknowingly. Okay, so two fallacies of analyzing poetry. One is historical and the other is personal. Now, historical and personal, it's very easy to assume what they actually mean. But basically, he believes that to make a proper and unbiased judgment of poetry, any new literature should be compared to works of the great masters with intense poetic quality. So, see, when we speak of historical and personal fallacies, what Arnold intends to believe is that try not to judge poetry just because it is, from a historical perspective, nor should you be unfairly biased. Unfairly biased as in how sometimes we tend to just like a certain kind of work, and even though the other works may be equally good, we are more inclined to like a certain kind of works, right? So you see, there is a certain personal prejudice at play there. So he says these two fallacies one should try to avoid. Just because something is historical, we should not revere it. I mean, something that is not something entirely new, we should not condemn it unfairly, right? So he devises this one theory, or you could call it a theory, okay, one hypothetical method probably. He calls it touchstone method. Touchstone as in like how you judge something by pitching it against something else. All right. So he says if we are thoroughly penetrated by their power, I mean, he says like you need to take up few works, very great works of the great masters with intense poetic quality. So even the great masters like Shakespeare or Dante or any other writer for that matter, any other great writer for that matter, Milton, they have created all sorts of work, and not every single line is a masterpiece, right? So there may be places, there may be stanzas or chapters that have great intense poetic value. So he tells us to choose those kind of works, those kind of passages, and he tells us to read them and absorb them, so that when you come across a new work or another work, you may be well equipped to analyze and assess the worth of this new work. All right, because you already have a sense of something really good and great. So you try to, and once it is inside you, once you have absorbed it completely, this quality of great work from a great master, you may be at a stage, at a certain point where you have mastered probably or perfected the art of judging a work of art, work of writing. All right, any writer for that matter. So he says if we are thoroughly penetrated by their power isn't the power of that passage of intense poetic quality. All right, he says if we are thoroughly penetrated by their power, we shall find that we have acquired a sense enabling us, whatever poetry may be laid before us, to feel the degree in which a high poetical quality is present or wanting there. Wanting there is in that is lacking there. Okay, so whatever poetry is laid before us, to feel the degree in which a high poetical quality. So if we are already aware, if we are already familiar with high poetic quality of a work of some worth, we may be able to judge whether it is present or absent in whatever work we are made to judge next. So he chose 11 passages, 3 from Homer, 3 from Dante, 3 from Milton, and 2 from Shakespeare. He says short passages, even single lines, will serve our turn quite sufficiently. So these passages, if one is well equipped with, if one is well absorbed, then you may have no difficulty judging any work for that matter, right? So that's what he calls the touchstone method. Please remember this. Again, there is another concept of high seriousness. High seriousness is a must for him in poetry, good poetry. So he insisted that a good poetry is that which has a certain moral seriousness. So no frivolity, no sentimentality. Sentimentality is in, like, the frivolous kind of sentimentality, that which does not deal with anything very serious. He disregards completely as unworthy of a poetic subject. All right. So he insisted that a good poetry is that which has a certain moral seriousness to it. So poetry that does not have truth or high seriousness is not worthy of being read. Please remember this. Arnold believed in serious poetry that would give you some moral purpose, would serve to enlighten you in some way, would actually take you ahead towards some kind of progress, some social progress, some individual progress. Without it, there is no point in reading poetry. So he rejected Elizabethans and romantics on these grounds. Obviously, Elizabethans, they were concerned with courtly love, or they were courtly manners. So the main, the subject of these poems, Elizabethan and romantic poems, were mostly romantic love, or the love of nature, or they were just praising the beauty of a beloved, or or sexual love. So there wasn't much to it. There was nothing worthy of being read, according to him, in Elizabethan or romantic poetry. The best poetry is what we want. The best poetry will be found to have a power of forming, sustaining, and delighting as nothing else can. So you see, according to Arnold, the best kind of poetry is that which is something we need, okay, something we want, okay, something that is not frivolous. See, you may gain so much by reading Alexander Pope, as far as I know. Can you say the same about probably Byron? Of course, literature wise, it's great, it's lovely to read, but do they serve any moral purpose? Do they serve any social purpose? Of course not. Okay, so you see, Arnold was a practical minded person. As far as I can see, he seems to be very insistent on making things matter. Okay, it was necessary for him that everything, any book you read, any work you read, any poetry you read, should contribute to your well-being, should contribute to your social well-being, your individual well-being. All right, otherwise he considered them utterly useless. The same goes for most of the writers of Victorian age. Whether take Ruskin for that matter, he has his entire series on what kind of books should men and women read. If you read Sesame and Lilies, it's a wonderful book that actually highlights the duties and responsibilities of men and women. What kind of responsibilities man has, what kind of responsibilities a woman should be accorded, or what kind of dignity, what kind of place a woman should be accorded, what kind of books she should be made to read, what kind of books a man ought to read. Of course, some have dubbed him as rather chauvinistic in approach, but actually it is very practical. It's a very practical book. We all ought to read it at least once before we condemn him completely. I'm talking about John Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies. Please do read it if you find time. Okay. So you see, writers of this age, Victorian era, they were very practical minded people, and they were concerned mainly with the society as such. Okay, they wanted to build a society, a healthy society, that did not reflect upon daffodils and hills and or fantastic lands of Kublai Khan. They wanted the society they were living in to flourish. They wanted everyone, every single child in their country to be educated. They wanted the factory conditions to be improved. They wanted the political reforms. They wanted, the farmers to get their due, for the all the hard work they were putting in. They wanted, equal rights for everyone. They were the kind of people who saw a certain seriousness. They found that seriousness was a necessity for them. Okay, they were done away with, living in their own world, imagining all sorts of things, and walking through the countryside, and writing elegies and poems. No, they were done with it all. They wanted poetry to serve a moral purpose, a purpose that would lead them to a higher purpose. Okay, a higher purpose where everyone improved. The life of every single individual in the society improved. All right, that's what was necessary for them. These people, they believed that a poetry should have the power of forming. Okay, forming as in creating, sustaining, and delighting. See, they are not saying that poetry should not delight, it should bore you. No, it may create, it may be created, it may create an impulse in you to do good. At the same time, it should continue to help you, sustain as in continue the process. So it's not as if like one flare of emotion, one inspiration is enough. No, it should be a continuing process. It should be a sustained effort as in continuous effort. Okay, at the same time, it should be delightful. It should, doing good should make you feel happy. You should not feel like a martyr as in sometimes, this is what most of the time happens, right? We tend to do something good and then we feel, oh my god, we become such a martyr, right? We feel so bad about having done anything good. And no, he feels that a poetry should delight you when it gives you any good impulse. That's the idea of high seriousness. Okay, there are furthermore some. Okay, we'll continue with these slides tomorrow, inshallah. Yeah. Okay, this is all for today. Thank you so much for your patient listening. Take care. Stay safe. Assalamu alaikum.